Hey, and welcome everybody. Welcome to another evening in the Teacher's Room at iTDi. We are the International Teacher Development Institute, and we do a number of interviews and open mics talking with teachers about 4 times a month. We're very happy tonight. Tonight being here in Kyoto, Japan, we're very happy to have Dr. Gianfranco Conti here as our special guest. And if you're not sure, he's the one in the black t-shirt, not the one in the white jumper on above. So welcome, John.
Welcome, lovely to be here with you.
Yeah, thank you. You've got a bunch of fans in our little circle of teachers. I think you've been all over the internet as of late, and everything. I've just had a short opportunity to Google you. And it's been very fun because, as I said to you earlier, we seem to have lots of things in common. Let's start with you introducing yourself for our viewers. I guess a little bit about where you started and how you got to wherever you are. And please take as much time as you need. I'm going to interrupt you with little follow-ups and more information stuff. So go
Absolutely.
ahead. Yeah.
First of all, I'm massively overrated. Now, basically, I started as a language teacher 28 years ago.
Wow.
Or even longer, actually. And I found that the training at university I got in England was absolutely inadequate. So what I did, I decided to further my knowledge of pedagogy after 2 years of comprehensive school teaching. Comprehensive schools in England means state school, basically.
Okay.
And I decided to do a master's in TEFL, and I completely stumbled. I don't know what happened. I wanted to do an applied linguistics master's, and then as I was at Reading University, I actually found that there was this MA TEFL, and somebody said, "Oh, it's good because they have this very famous professor called Cyril Weir, and you have." And other people, Ron White, and I never heard these names before. I said, okay, I'll do it. It sounds more practical than the other one. And then I was bombarded with like amazing stuff every day. It was like cognitive science here, cognitive science there, pragmatic social linguistics, and all these sort of really mind-blowing things that these great lectures were disseminating. And then I decided to go back into teaching by university first.
So which school, which university were you at for the master's?
Reading University, Reading.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And for instance, Martin Bygate, that now has become one of the fathers of task-based learning with his obsession with task repetition, was one of my lecturers. And I had all this incredible people, like, I don't know if you heard of Cyril Weir.
Yes.
Very famous for testing. Don Porter, one of the fathers of phonology and all that in England anyway. So when I went back to university to teach this time, I started to apply that. And then I got back into a secondary school teaching. And this time I had all these ideas coming from the TEFL world, which of course I adapted to the modern language context, which is different because you have big classes, highly unmotivated kids who don't want to do French, Spanish, or German or Latin. And I had to find a fun way of mixing the cognitive science, which was completely unknown in the secondary world, absolutely ignored. People do what I call the folklore teaching. Basically, what you've been taught by teachers before, which is not a bad thing, don't get me wrong, but often felt a bit random and against everything that I learned about connectionism, about information processing theory, and of course, it was the exciting times where brain imaging was starting to come on the scene. So now we actually saw what was happening in the brain. And for instance, for me, it was enlightening to see that declarative knowledge is stored in the prefrontal cortex. And instead, procedural knowledge was another side. And then it made me actually wonder, man, maybe Krashen is right. Maybe what you learn subconsciously and consciously or vice versa is not necessarily connected. And even if it is, when I learn or teach a grammar paradigm, doesn't mean that it becomes automatic. Even if I keep repeating to myself 100 times, I may have the illusion this is automatized, but it's still a grammar rule. Hence, it's still declarative. Hence, it's not available for fluency, you know? And then all these kind of questions, it was an exciting time when I started to then decide to produce resources which applied all the beautiful things I was starting to learn about the bilingual lexicon and all that. What I omitted to say is that whilst I was a lecturer in university, I did my PhD. And I focused on 3 areas. One was language acquisition using the Anderson-Act-Star model, which is basically cognitive science applied to language learning.
Yeah.
Metacognition, I was using all the theory from Anita Wenden and all the way up to the fathers of metacognition, O'Malley and Chameau and all the rest. And then, of course, error correction, because I was basically studying how metacognitive instruction can enhance writing. Once I got back into education, like state education, I was so energized by all these ideas, all these findings. And the father of modern language teaching in England was actually my supervisor, who happened to be at Oxford University. So he asked me to do a study with him in comprehensive schools, applying my ideas and his ideas to a massive, large-scale study in 6 schools. So I had firsthand of what a very difficult endeavor, to put it nicely, educational research not in the lab but in school is. Yeah. And it also made me understand that although we try as researchers to find a balance between the pragmatics of the classroom and research, educational research is far from being exact science.
Yeah, there's just too many factors involved, and it's just such a messy situation to begin with, isn't it?
Not only, but when you're working with teenagers, because when you're working with university students, at least you know that they might be on time, they might be doing what you ask them to do, and the lectures are a little bit freer. But when you're working in secondary school with teachers who are rushing around from class to class, so since that experience, whenever I come across any big claim made through schools, the school-based research, secondary school-based research, yeah, I'm a bit more skeptical, not because it doesn't mean that there is some truth in it, but I think qualitative research in a way is much better than quantitative one when it comes to language learning, unless you're working in the lab with a super controlled a set of informants and in a very controlled environment. So after that,
do you think that statement? I agree with you that the qualitative may be more effective. Is that any kind of controversy amongst people in the profession these days, or do you think that's a general agreement? What do you think?
I think everyone understands that qualitative research must be the starting point, so that you identify issues that you might then pursue if you have a lot of money, time, and support quantitatively. But I think what people understand, because I met Professor Ellis recently, right?
Yeah.
And I studied from his books. But when he came on stage and he started to do his keynote, I actually wondered how many of his claims were actually supported. When he was saying certain things about how many times a student Shintani had taught his students new language implicitly through trust-based learning, repeating things 6 times, and how that could have been generalizable to other environments, I found it a bit laughable, because I know that if I'd done that with my own kids,
yeah,
teenagers, after the 6th time hearing the same thing, they would have basically told me to F off, for instance, just to give you an example. Sure. So it's the principle of what he was trying to convey, the methodology, the framework. Okay, you can say to me that you worked in that specific classroom with those specific kids, with that specific teacher, and it's great because then I can try it out in my classroom. but don't give it to me as something supporting a methodology, because it doesn't wash, you know.
My favorite in that big fat purple book of Rod Ellis's was reading the scenario where he did a 2-hour lesson with a 14-year-old girl, and then went on to talk about all kinds of implications and results from that. And I had exactly the same kind of feeling. Before
I'll tell you more.
I just want to
tell you.
I want to tell everybody we have the chat going here, and so
Okay.
feel free to write in any questions or follow up, and I will try to keep track of the chat as it's going, while Jan and I just keep bouncing back and forth. But carry on, Jan.
Yeah, I wanted to tell you about this, still on task-based learning, because I was reading Michael Long's book on task-based learning, because in Australia, it's now become compulsory to do task-based learning. And of course, nobody's doing it. And they called me to sort of translate into practical classroom sort of rendition methodology what these people, preach in a good way. Yeah. And then I read Michael Long, and there was this pre-task that was supposed to be the prelude to a task about finding directions on the map. I don't know why, but whenever a task-based learning advocate talks to you about task-based learning, it's always either a map or a map. It's never anything else. It's always either drawing an island and locating things, or getting from the supermarket to the cinema. And Michael Long, who he's a holy, sacred cow. You cannot touch that guy. I don't know why. Whenever you say something on Twitter about him, you get crucified. It's like being under a firing squad. And he says, before you get to the actual task, you will practice the same chunks, the same direction, 60 times. And it's like, not the same direction, but the same sort of chunk, sentence pattern, 60 times. And it does qualify saying that it's for adults. But I always had in the back of my mind, and this is where my sanity comes in when I translate EFL to ML, modern languages, is that I know that if I did 60 times with adolescents, directions in a row with 3 different maps, because he says 20 times 3, my students would just walk out, or would start hitting me with things or calling me names, and I would lose control, and they would never pursue languages to GCSE, which is basically when the exam, when they can decide to actually drop languages or carry on. Yeah. And this is the big crossover that I always try to not expose, is a bad word, but to make EFL people aware of, because of course, when you're working with adolescents who are in their 11 to 14 years, 15 years, when they all think about is trainers, mobile phones, girlfriends, sex, and their parents giving a lot of hassle, you need to make language learning scientific, of course, but also engaging and fun. And yes, 60 times is a scientific way of creating input flooding, sure, because 60 times, anyone will get it in the end. Yeah. On the other hand, you need to also make sure that you keep your kids engaged, which unfortunately these days is not very easy, because you have to avoid the so what effect, which unfortunately these kids are very, very, very sensitive to these days, because they're educational mercenaries. They don't learn languages for language's sake like I used to do. These kids want a reason for it.
Right.
And I think that was a big advantage for me, having all the know-how from the EFL world, translating into resources for the classroom. And as I was telling you earlier in the pre-interview, the good thing about this was that in the ML world, nobody knew anything about the EFL world, because the two worlds don't talk to each other. So for instance, you find that an ML teacher, a modern language teacher, is a whiz in controlling the classrooms, even the dodgiest, the most impervious to learning. On the other hand, in terms of the variety of tools that you EFL teachers, I put myself in that, but I don't deserve it. I can tell you that mixing them together, you have an amazing chemistry of knowledge and tools and strategies, which unfortunately the ML world at that time, and arguably to this day, was missing. And so I mixed them together. I created resources, which I based very much on information processing theory, what we knew about memory, what we knew about the phonological store, and how the importance of phonological memory learning. So I created a lot of reading aloud interactive games. I brought into the ML world activities which are the staples of EFL, maybe tweaking them a bit and making them more palatable for teachers. And suddenly I found myself being nominated for this award, which in our world is like world of ML. It's called the TES Award. It's a platform where teachers share resources. And I found myself getting downloaded like there's no tomorrow. And of course, the ego got a little bit of a boost, which very good for motivation, self-efficacy. I felt, oh, let's produce more and more. And as you know, in Italy, we say the appetite comes eating, as you eat. And I started to produce loads of resources. And then suddenly, everyone in England knew me, which was weird because I was working in a small classroom by the swimming pool in Malaysia, and nobody, I bet, knew me until that point. And then they nominated for this award twice. And I never got it because they told me, can you come to England? I said, well, if my principal let me, but he's not going to let me go unless you tell me if I won. And they would say, no, it has to be a surprise. I said, what? Kuala Lumpur, England, like 1,000 quid just to get there. You won't tell me if I won it or not. Of course I'm not going to come. And the third time, I didn't give any answer. Just said, well, maybe I will. And then I said, I will. But then I didn't, but I still got the prize. So I got the prize, and that launched me into my next endeavor, which was basically starting to write a blog. At that point, people were curious because, you know, there are bloggers who are way better than me, who know much more than me, who are more creative than me. But because I had the initial platform, I guess, of that TS award, people were curious. I say, I've used this guy's resources at least once. It was okay. It was fun. It was good. I don't know, it worked. Or at least it was different. So they decided to start reading my blog. And then I found that cognitive science, which I was disseminating. That was the purpose of my blog at the beginning, to let people know a bit more about the science of the brain and how to apply it to languages, became a bit quite topical. And then other people follow through, and I'm very proud. So if you say that my biggest achievement is to actually get teachers who would not have the time or the resources or the money to have access to a specific area of research.
So why don't you stop here for a moment and give us a little introduction to what kind of resources you've produced. I mean, we're very, some groups don't want people being commercial, but we really encourage good people who have done good things to share what they've done and tell us where we can find some of the resources that what kind have you done and where do we find them?
Yeah, of course, you need to bear in mind that unfortunately or fortunately, a lot of these resources will be directed to teachers of French, Spanish, German, and Italian. So you can find loads on the TES, which is a Times Educational Supplement, which is this big, huge platform, the biggest in the world, I think, for teachers. They can find them there. Of course, on my blog, I explain quite a few things which can be used. And in fact, I've been promoted by the British Council, the Teaching English page. That was the biggest development, actually, if you want, in my career recently, that made me known to ELT people, because I started to put them out there on my blog. And the good feedback I got is that a lot of them could be adapted to EFL. And on my blog, I think you can find a sort of a microcosm of resources which you'll find in the other two books put together that I produce. So if you, for instance, you don't have to, of course, buy my book, but in Breaking the Sound Barrier, which is my latest book, which is about listening, you'll find a lot of resources, 216, but you'll have to pay the the price of the book, of course. However, you can find quite a few of them if you're keen in my blog completely for free, and there's loads of them there. The resources on the TS will be, there's maybe 400 which are commercial, but there's also 1,500 which are completely free, which I kept free because it's only fair. At the moment, if you are also keen to explore other resources, there's quite a few people who, they haven't copied me, but they drew inspiration from me, and they posted quite a lot on the TS. They're all centered around the premise that you need to have a lot of recycling, you have to have a lot of input flooding, you have to put sentence patterns first, you have to move away from the single word plus grammar paradigm, but work more in terms of what we call lexicography. And so they have a common thread, which is, how do we teach bearing in mind cognitive load? How can we easify language learning? Because one of the things that I fought for the last 5 years, how do we make language learning and fluency more easily accessible? Because so far it's been always an elitist endeavor. It's always about teaching students how to intellectually form sentences, applying grammar rules, very much like teaching maths. And of course, what research has shown nowadays is that unless you have a very powerful working memory, loads of motivation, and more importantly, a very, very good phonological memory within your working memory, you may not be suitable for this kind of learning.
Well, the problem here in Japan is I taught in a private high school for 20 years here, and I taught from like 12-year-olds up to 18-year-olds. And that whole grammar method, as you said, teaching it like an academic subject, I often say it's like teaching it like teaching Latin. They're learning to decipher and to decode language, not anything to do with learning how to use it. But the problem is that it works really well for 10% of the class. So 4 girls out of the 40 got into that. They had that cognitive load capacity, and they end up becoming the future English teachers. And that's been the cycle over and over in Japan, that we've had this problem.
I'm nodding big time, because in England, we finally woke up to the truth, because people carrying on with languages to A levels, which is basically 17 to 18, is nearly zero in a lot of schools. And in other schools, you'll find that even a GCSE, which is a 16 plus examination, the kids who carry on are a fraction of the kids who start. And now that there's a big crisis also because of Brexit, of course, where languages are becoming devalued, when people are trying to get as far from Europe as they can. I know it sounds bad, but that's the reality of things. Now, you find that people are starting to ask themselves why. And I'm finding myself for the first time, and I should be happy because, of course, I make money that way. I find myself being invited nearly every day for every mini tour of England that I do, because people are searching for answers, which, of course, I can only partially give. But what I try and make sure people understand, which in America, in Canada, you guys do. I mean, you, because you're Canadian, I'm not sure where Michael and the others are from, but the notion, for instance, you laugh now, but the notion that you learn how to speak from a model which involves oral input, you know, it's just an obvious thing. I give you input like a mother, and you process it several times over. Then at some point you try out to negotiate meeting with another individual. And then if you understand each other fine, or if you're negotiating meaning over and over again, at some point communication will happen, and learning and reinforcement and all the rest. Well, the first passage, the first step, I found that in England, in every single classroom that I've taught or observed over 25 years of teaching, the comprehensible input thing doesn't happen. Listening is pressing a button, listening to a tape, answering 5 questions. And my question was, for over 25, 28 years, was, how do these kids ever get to talk? Whereas in America, you have teachers telling you, don't let them talk for weeks. In England, it was like flashcards, tape, and the kids were immediately having a go. And of course, in Spanish, you can kind of cope because you don't need massively good developed decoding skills or pronunciation. But in French, it's a nightmare. Yeah. So guess which language is losing out completely now to Spanish? And
yeah,
French is nearly is basically on its way out. German has already been lost. And the one thing that Steve Smith, my co-author, are really trying to drum in, I just posted something on Global Innovative Language Teachers about this, is the importance of decoding skills, pronunciation, and phonotactics to make sure that the phonological loop, that's why I'm making this crazy circle with my finger, the phonological loop in working memory, a phonological memory is tapped into sufficiently enough to allow these kids to master at least the fluency of articulation and to maximize the use of phonological memory. We know that we can only fit so many words in our working memory. The scientists talk about 4 or 5. If you're highly proficient, maybe 7. The idea that kids don't do more than 10, 15 minutes of reading aloud or talking, if you're lucky, in a lesson at beginner stage, means that you delay the onset of fluency massively. And these new discoveries, there's been a lot of studies in the last 20 years. There's a great book by Anne de Groot, 2019, that I'm currently reading, Language and Cognition in Bilinguals. And she reviews all the studies and is shocking how ignorant teachers are of the fact that it's all about phonological memory, how effectively, accurately, and fluently a child manages in their heads first to process as many words as they can on that loop. You call it a metaphor or envisage it in any other way, but it's a kind of loop, the way scientists try and portray it. That is so key that, according to Paul Nation, if you are at the very early stages of learning a language and you want to learn 15 words, according to him, it might take you several hours, to learn those 15 words.
5 minutes a word to really know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas if you meet the same child or the same student 6 months later, they can fit 100 new words in 1 hour. And that's because of the phonotactics. They learn how each syllable is connected to another. They learn how to master the connection between the two, how the blending of each assimilation in terms of syllables a word actually works. And of course, by repeating those words in several contexts, they basically develop this mastery of phonotactics, which is absolutely key. So finally, partially thanks to me, in England now, there's a big push for something that we used to do centuries ago, reading aloud, with community language teaching said, it's bad, it's not real, you shouldn't do reading aloud. But actually, it is. I mean, when my daughter was little, my ex-wife was reading to her every night, for God's sake, so it is a naturally occurring thing. But I don't know if you remember, dictation, reading during the community language teaching days was taboo. You don't do it. And now guess what people are discovering again? Dictation, reading aloud. It's just hilarious how the pendulum swings, doesn't it?
Yeah. Wow. So you've given us such a wide range of thoughts and ideas here. I want to try to go back a little bit to the premise. You talked about the premise of your lessons being you know, having lots of opportunities for recycling and lots of opportunities for input. I wonder what's the best way for you to walk us through some kind of lesson that you know works really well, either tying in an activity, but I think you've got everybody on board right now. And if we can put this into some kind of, I don't know how long your high school lessons were, 50 minutes, an hour? What would
well, it's interesting because instead of lessons, I talk about what I call a pedagogic cycle.
Sure, good.
So instead, I never plan a lesson per se,
right?
Because I use this kind of acronym, which Steve Smith always mocks me for. MAS is. What does MAS is means? Means that you start with modeling, the M. So you model patterns and chunks. So you absolutely no single words. Remember, I'm trying to target in my so-called innovation, which I don't think it is really, but in my approach, beginners to lower, intermediates and intermediates.
Okay.
So imagine beginner intermediates, because if I were to teach advanced or upper intermediate, it would be different. So let's take as a premise that you inquiring about what people seem to like the most of my approach, which is my concern with that band, so the ability range. So modeling starts in whichever way you like, but it concerns patterns and chunks. So I use sentence frames, what in the EFL world you call substitution tables, kind of, except that I use them orally, to model orally. And I make sure that after that modeling phase, which is all oral and involves kids using mini whiteboards, I was surprised to find out that in many parts of the world, mini whiteboards are not used. For instance, I've recently been I go to Australia a lot, and in Australia, for instance, there's many schools that never heard of mini whiteboards. Mini whiteboards are key in my approach because you want to have kids absolutely showing where their brain is at, what's going on through there. And I found that, for instance, when I was teaching EFL on my CELTA, never seen a mini whiteboard. So when you ask kids, it's kids either putting their hand up, whereas this way you're getting every single person to show what's going on by giving you the answer. So mini whiteboards are important for what comes next, which is basically, M, modeling. A is what I call awareness raising, which is pop-up grammar. So when you introduce with your beautiful substitution table or sentence builder or sentence frame, whatever you want to call it, you're basically not lingering too much on grammar. Because my approach, and I think it's common sense, grammar should be used, not talked about. And when you use a patterns-based approach, when you present a sentence structure through a substitution table or sentence builder, whatever you want to call it, you are basically already imparting grammar. Because you are basically already showing where each word goes in the sentence. Sure. So if you're teaching French, you don't have to say, hey, the adjective goes after the noun, because it's obvious, it's there. And if you see prepositions in one column, you know that preposition goes after that verb. You know what I mean? Yep. And in Japanese, you will know that the verb goes at the end, because you see it on the sentence structure. So pop-up grammar means where the teacher is basically showing the students very briefly things that might be useful to know. For instance, if you're teaching French and Spanish, you may want to say, look, the nouns in this box are all feminine. The ones right here are masculine. Guys, you notice that the adjective goes here. Do you notice that the infinitive has pour in front rather than in order to, So you basically show things that might be important to know, but you're not going to delve into it. It's not going to be a deep dive into the grammar in that. After that, after the A, which is awareness raising of pop grammar, there's a long period of listening as modeling, as I call it. In other words, these are activities which are designed to model, not the typical listening where you ask question, What did Mary do? At what time? At what time did she shower? And what did she eat? What dog? What's the dog's name? Nothing like that. These are listening activities which are designed to input flood. In other words, to bombard the students with the same occurrence, with various occurrences of the same chunks and patterns in a very engaging and fun way. And these activities are either listening, where the teacher is acting as a nurturer, as a modeler, as opposed to the inquisitor, the quizzer. So the kids is constantly interacting with the students in a fun way. And very often these listening activities involve what we call scripted listening. For instance, give an example. Spot the intruder. Yeah, I give them a text, transcript on the board. I insert intruders here and there. The kids need to listen to me while reading silently, of course, and note down on the mini whiteboard the intruding word. Or the opposite, spot the missing detail. I don't put any gaps. I just remove words because I want the students to focus on every single word I'm saying, so that I recycle the same chunks in the same way. And the kids needs on the mini whiteboards to note down what the intruder is. Or spot the difference, where you have, again, a transcript on the board. I'm reading a transcript which is 90% identical, but there are words which differ. Why? Because I'm modeling that the same sentence patterns can be used in a different way. So for instance, if I said, I went to Canada on this transcript, I might actually say, yesterday I went to Japan, and they will have to note down the difference. So activities which are fast-paced, which recycle the same chunks over and over again. Why? The idea is, if I bombard the students with the same, with similar input, which targets those patterns, I will give them plenty of opportunities to recycle them receptively, which is easier, in what we call dual coding, because you have letters and sound, which means greater chances of retention. And after a period of constant bombardment through these engaging activities, which are not just teacher directed, because we came out, Steve and I, with a wide range of read aloud games, which up to us were called speaking activities, but they're not. They're reading aloud activities, because a lot of the speaking activities that are called speaking activities, even in the EFL classroom, because they happen with a sheet that you're reading, is basically not speaking, is reading aloud. I like to call it chunking aloud. So when people say, oh, I've done a speaking activity involving information gap, no. There's a kid with a sheet and there's another kid with a sheet, so they're just reading aloud. And this is very important for us, because in my approach, we want to make clear that this is not really production. It's production because they're using the articulators, but the most important thing for us is that this is completely CI, comprehensible input. 95% is the threshold for the average classroom. Nothing must be more than 95%, less than 95% comprehensible. This is very important because we know that anything less than 95 doesn't lead to learning. And this is one of the most flouted principles. When you get through this quite lengthy receptive learning phase, which involves listening and reading, then only then we get to a forced output phase. So imagine we've just done one lesson of modeling and listening. The second lesson would be when you get to the forced output bit. Forced output means that you create highly structured activities where you ensure that the kids are saying exactly what you want them to say. Why did I do that? Because in secondary schools in England and in a lot of CELTA training that I received and I saw, what happens? The kids are given this listening and reading phase, and then they say, okay, now let's do a task. And the task very often, in England anyway, involves something like, okay, guys, now describe each other's mums. Or what did you do last weekend? Have a conversation. interview each other. And of course, if you ask a child, especially a demotivated child, or somebody who's kind of not particularly bothered, what do you do at the weekend? They're going to come out with the same answer for the rest of their lives, which is, I played football, I ate pizza, I went to McDonald's, and if they're really enlightened, I did my homework. And you find in England, kids learn only those 3 sentences in French, so much so that we have a joke that circulated on Twitter for a while. I met my French teacher 20 years later. She asked me, what do you do the weekend? And I answered, j'ai joué au foot, j'ai mangé de la pizza, et je me suis couché à minuit. Actually, not even the last sentence, just j'ai joué au foot.
Mine was Fido marche dans la rue.
Exactly.
You know, so just let me quit. One of our listeners put in a really good question. Erica. How do you make 95% comprehensible input with a new learner? So if you're giving them a text, surely most of the input is new and unknown.
Absolutely. And this is exactly the kind of question that I get asked every single time I do a workshop. This is key. This is key because we always been told that you have to provide students with authentic texts. But if you're teaching a beginner, you're not going to put it, it's like putting a beginner driver on the highway on a Ferrari. Yep. You want to give them what we called, and we all called in applied linguistics, controlled input. I'm going to provide the students with the input he or she can do because number 1, has to be 95% comprehensible. Number 2, has to be flooded input, enriched input. If I give an authentic text, unless it's a nursery rhyme, it won't be flooded input. It will be pretty random. Whereas you want to make sure not only that it's 95% comprehensible, but it contains several instances of the less noticeable items and of the items that you want them definitely to learn. Why do kids never learn less salient items like prepositions, connectives? Why don't they? Because we give them texts which are way too difficult for them, beyond their level, sometimes in the name of authenticity, and we don't flood them, we don't enrich them, so that the students don't get enough opportunity to notice less salient items. So what we preach in my approach is you need to input flood as much as you can. You need to ensure that you gauge the text, that the highest you can go in terms of incomprehensibility is 90%. And this is, by the way, the same guidelines given by the ACTA, the Association, the American Council for Teaching Languages. So that's not just me, this is the whole country now saying, guys, has to be 90% comprehensible input. So the answer to Eric...
Nation and Crashen and some of the best minds in the world are saying this. Erica writes one more comment just to pass on to you. Presumably, even if I write my own, then for a new French learner, this can only happen once we've covered some basic personal details, for example. And I would say, on top of that, maybe if she looked at some of your materials through your site, that we'd get a good idea of what some of this looks like in action. Is that fair?
Absolutely. You see, the one thing that I struggled for many years was adapting texts from textbooks, spending hours adapting text or creating glossaries. And actually, it takes less time doing it yourself. And there's a great idea that I took from Crashen, and of course, being the linguistic pervert that I am, I adapted, is narrow reading and narrow listening. What are narrow readings and narrow listening? Basically, the same text copied and pasted many times over. So you have the same discourse frame, because we know that we chunk everything. We don't just chunk syllables, words, or sentences. According to Michael Hoy, the father of lexical priming theory, we chunk discourse frames. That's how journalists write so quickly.
Yeah. And when you come to Japan, you notice that there's a chunked phrase for almost every situation you're likely to encounter. And if you spent the first couple of years learning all those chunks, you can get through 90% of your day. It's amazing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know, I found since I, like yourself, have become a blogger and a writer, what did I find? I found that we actually start thinking in paragraphs.
Yes.
I actually start picturing out before I even write. I know where it's going to go. So the idea of this narrow listening that I took from Krashen is a genius. Although I don't like him, he's a bloody genius. And what it did is it's a very clever thing. It says, you know what? When you're giving students, I don't know, a text, a frame to learn on how to describe hobbies, talk about hobbies, go and interview 6 native speakers, because more or less, they're going to tell you the same thing. Yeah. So if you ask them, what do you do on the weekend? Most likely they're going to start by saying, well, in the morning I do this, in the afternoon, yeah. And they will use more or less the same vocabulary, jargon, idioms. So I push it a bit further because I'm a control freak with beginners. And my idea is, let's copy and paste it 6 times over. Let's change only key items here and there. So the students are going to learn those items within the same frame. And make sure that you exploit each text in a different way, so that you have the brain focusing only on the lexical level in one activity, on the spelling on the other, on reading aloud on the other, on chunks on the other, arranging meaning in the right order, sequencing the main ideas. In other words, giving the students the chance to work at every level of processing. Why? Because the brain cannot focus on more than one at a time.
Yeah.
The biggest flaw of listening and reading instruction in every classroom I observed in 28 years is that we ignore this, because we've always been told that a text has to be exploited in one and one only way, which is a quiz. So when Steve and I wrote the book, we said, no, it can't be, because working memory, the brain, can only focus at one level at a time. So let's make sure that when we do a listening activity, or a bunch of listening activities, we ensure that the brain focuses on as many levels as possible, so the same language is processed at all the 5 or 6 main levels of processing that the brain goes through. And when we go from the written word or the spoken word all the way up to the building of discourse. That way you get receptive learning, which prepares for productive learning, because you are given the brain plenty of opportunities to process each target item many times over from different angles, from extracting different cues. Whereas the 5 minutes, 10 minutes activity that we normally know, according to a number of researchers like Chambers 1996, for instance, that we spend on the listening comprehension is hardly going to model anything.
Right.
That's why, there was a great paper by De Jong, 2006. He makes a very important point, which changed the way I teach, which is, when we go to production too soon, we are actually inducing error, because we haven't given the students the opportunity, the possibility to actually internalize what has been modeled. Example, how many times do teachers say, repeat after me? Now, if you're a gifted student with a great phonological memory, you will say the or think. But if you are a German student who's maybe not as phonologically adept, you'll say, I think. Give them the chance 6, 7, 8 times over to listen, to think in different guises, in different contexts, at different speed, and then say, right, let's have a go. Maybe with a little bit of pop-up grammar into it, like, guys, the tongue goes here, the tooth, the teeth go there, you need to do this, touch your vocal cords, anything. Whereas for years, I've been taught to just show a flashcards, say it in English or French or whatever, and ask my students to repeat it immediately. And of course, you only focus on the good ones who can say correctly, because you want to ignore the people at the back of the classroom who will then make mistakes. And I would argue that a lot of the correction that we have to do in our lessons is because we miss out on this very important stage, which is consolidation through the receptive modalities.
I've got a couple of more questions here in the chat, but I want to add a couple of my own as well.
Sure.
Before that, you mentioned the role of fun in the classroom. I'd like you to talk about that just for a couple of minutes. That's been something that came up in our recent TESOL course. But go ahead. Is it necessary and or useful and or important for the classroom to be a fun place?
All right. Engagement does not equate to learning. But we know that when your students are engaged and there is attention which is sustained and targeted, we know we learn better. An example I always give in my workshop: try and tell somebody, look at the crowd. And then try and tell the same person, look at your mother in the crowd. You can actually observe physiologically changes in the retina, in the way we look. Retina is not the right word, but changes in the cells, because of course you are doing something deliberate, targeted, and you're concentrating your cognitive resources on one thing. So cognitive arousal is a must, especially with this generation of teenagers. Why? If I'm a freshman in Oxford University who needs English because I've got a scholarship from my government, and if I fail them, I feel ashamed for the rest of my life and maybe I need to give the money back, I'm cognitively aroused on a daily basis. However, if I'm a teenager in England or Australia, even worse, that who needs to learn French in Brisbane, you know, I need to have, number one, that connection with the teacher. And that connection with the teacher is formed through little gestures that you do every day. It's formed through motivation, of course, through success, self-efficacy, but unless you do meaningful play, not just random games, not the silly little games that I see sometimes, like tic-tac-toe. Okay, you can do it once in a while, but it should be meaningful play that has a rationale behind it. So imagine I want to work on decoding skill, on phonological ability, basically, phonological memory. I say, kids, go on your mini whiteboards, and I play one of my most favorite games. It's called basically mind reading, yeah? I put some sentences on the board containing rigorously the same pattern, control freak, and the kids are copying down on the mini whiteboards 3 sentences each, secretively. They can't see them. And all they have to do is ping pong guesses at each other. Each time they get it right, tick, you got 1. 1-0, 2-0. Whenever I say stop or whenever the game is over, who's won the most is the winner. Now, it's game, it's engaging. I've done it for a reason. I'm trying to flood the same pattern in their heads. I'm working on the reading aloud skills, which I prioritize in my approach because of the phonological memory I mentioned before. And I need to think about what game is going to come after. And I'm going to ask myself, why is that game going to come after? How is it building on the previous one? If you play games this way, and you move from that highly controlled game to a beautiful game like the 4-3-2 techniques by Paul Nation, or Messengers, or Marketplace, where the students have to perform against the clock, quite high level. So you moved from a highly controlled, planned to unplanned. And before that game, which is a bit more difficult, you had a planning stage to reduce cognitive load. In other words, if your games are informed by a solid rationale and follow a principled framework, they are as good as any other tasks. Now, that kind of engagement, to me, is not just valuable, is a must with younger learners. Younger learners, I mean, from 5 to 16, because I taught them all, and I am fully aware of the challenges. The problem with a lot of games in the FL world especially is they're absolutely random. They're cool, they're great, but when you look at the sequence, why is it there? What is he trying to achieve? One of the things that I always transpires from all of the workshops that I've done, and I've done 160 this year only, 160, that's why I look like a complete wreck. The whole thing that I ask, the same question I ask is, why are you doing this speaking or listening activity? And you know what the answer of most teachers is? I rarely ask myself that question, if ever.
Yeah.
So that's my answer. I think games need to be with younger learners, part and parcel of every lesson. However, if you have a highly motivated group of kids who just love you and they'll do exactly what you say because you have the charisma and the appeal that a lot of people have and a lot of people unfortunately don't, then you can get away with simply being intellectually stimulating.
Sure.
But with teenagers, pubescent these days, there's another reason, if you don't mind me prolonging the answers. The reason is these days, you know, you need to sit down like I've done recently with a few kids that parents asked me to monitor because they were not doing well in school. And they wanted to understand what was going on. They happened to be children of friends of mine. Yeah. So I actually sat with them for up to 2 or 3 hours because the parents were very concerned. And you know what they were doing? They were playing Xbox or PlayStation. And when they were doing that, the most important thing to them was not the game itself, but the counter, the score they were getting. And that was an eye-opener for me because we are not, I personally, I'm not you guys, but I wasn't brought up like that. It wasn't the most important thing for me. They end up paying hundreds of dollars per game just to get their parents to buy them weapons that they can use so they can kill better or escape more easily or have more chances to survive. So if you want to addict your students to language learning, you need to talk the same language they're used to.
Yeah.
And it's not enough to just say fantastique these days. So what I always talk about in my blogs and in my book is 2 points. One is the very famous so what effect, but the other one is the empty hands effect. If I'm describing a house on a picture, okay, maybe I get gratified because I can do it. On the other hand, many other kids won't. So you need to find a way to make sure that the kids have a tangible product, a tangible sense of achievement, but also some sort of reward, which doesn't have to be the chocolate, but it has to be, as, for instance, I tell you an example. In my highly structured activities, we introduce the figure of the referee, a third person who has the answers, who has the solution, who has a quantifiable way of adjudicating points. And we found that it made all the difference. Because if I'm simply translating sentences, I'm just translating sentences. If I'm competing with my friends at translating sentences and then other children at the answers, I'm already introducing a competition which is fair. Because normally you find loads of EFL board games that make me laugh because they're great games, but fun enough, nobody has the solution. So I always wonder, how do they play? Because the teacher can't be everywhere when you have 30 kids. So it's a great game, but you find the kids questioning the teacher all the time. What is the right answer? Arguing with each other, or simply is the better kids of the two who says, this is the answer. And the other kid, because, So it was longer than 2 minutes.
That's okay. Let's wrap up. We're right at the time here, but I wanted to ask Rebecca had the question about what's your opinion on the role of the L1 in the L2 classroom?
There's a lot of research nowadays saying that it's very, very useful. Depends what you do with it.
Yeah.
If you are totally reliant on the L1 all the time, then of course it's not a good thing. If you use the L1 as a scaffold. So we know, for instance, from research that the L1 is useful in inducing, eliciting, noticing. Because if I have a translation of a French sentence with adjectives next to me, I notice a massive difference already, that the word order of the adjective is different. Same thing with German or Japanese in terms of sentence structure. We also know that the similarities are hugely important. Finding the similarity to two languages is extremely good in fostering the development of grammar. So if you're using the L1 judiciously to scaffold learning.
That's the magic word, isn't it? Judiciously.
So for instance, I've seen explanations of hours for a grammar point, which is hard to learn already in the first language, let alone in French or German or English. So reducing cognitive load is one great reason to use the L1.
Yeah.
To illustrate a point of, you know, differences between the two languages, and also for what I call forced output. Very often you want the students to have dialogues and you spend hours drawing pictures because you're not supposed to use the L1. Yeah. And I'm saying, really, if I see a cloud or I write cloud, does it really make a difference? It's still visual. Yeah, but you're not using the L1. Well, Paul Nation in Newton and Nation 2014, they write something very intelligent, which is based on science, which is, we know that when beginners are developing their subsystem, the L2 subsystem in the brain, at the beginning, the translation and the target language word are closely associated in the brain. We know from the kind of mistakes.
L1 is there. It's there, whether you want to admit it's there or not.
Exactly.
Our good friend Penny Ur talks about there's nothing that should never be used in the classroom or should always be. It's a tool, just like a whole bunch of other tools that we carry.
Exactly. So. You know, I'll tell you something very interesting that's happened to me for years. When I first started, I was called many names, not very nice, by a lot of the English establishment in terms of language learning, because my sentence builder, my substitution tables had English next to the French word. Mm. And of course, the reason is I want comprehensible input. It doesn't mean that it's going to stay there for the next lesson or the lesson after. At the beginning, it's there because you want to create a vocabulary-rich environment without losing the students. So it's a scaffold. Then you will remove 30%, 50%, 60% until lesson 3, that sentence builder will be completely French. So that's an example of how it's a useful way, a crutch for the students to hold on when they are walking through a very good, difficult route, which is acquisition, when you don't need anymore. And the kids have acquired, or at least routinized, part of that vocabulary, all that vocabulary, then you'll remove it. But to say dogmatically no, and make, because we have to think about one thing. In America, they have 5, on Canada, they have 5 hours languages a week. In Europe, you're lucky if you have 1 or 2 in England. Yeah. So the question is, if you have 5 hours, by all means, use gestures, use all the comprehension checks that you want to do with pictures and that. If you only have 2 hours, you have to think, do I really want to spend 20 minutes using the L1? And you know what? We always have to think about inclusion. We have to think about the one student at the back of the classroom who doesn't get your explanation, only one. Mm. And if you're the father or the mother of that kid who's going to hate languages forever because you insisted on a dogma, think, is it really worth?
Yeah, it's not. Yeah. Wow. Listen, John, we could carry on and on and on, it seems. Next time you're in Japan, let me know. And if you get to Kyoto or Osaka area, I'd love to take you out and have a beer and a dinner and carry on this conversation. Maybe we'll have to record it. And
I'm very happy to do this again. It was very, very nice to be with you guys.
Yeah, it was wonderful. Thank you so much. And everybody else, thank you. We'll put this up on the we'll put it up on the YouTube soon, and I'll get a copy to you. And I'm sure we're going to be in touch again, John. Thank you so much.
I'm delighted. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All the best. Everybody. Ciao, everyone.
Ciao.
Ciao. Bye-bye.